Good morning. Let's get started. So today we're going to go over an introduction to Illustrator. But first I'd like to just briefly go over assignment 3, which is due on Thursday night. So basically you'll use Illustrator to reconstruct and improve one of your old presentation boards using Illustrator and vector graphics. If you don't have old presentation boards, I would just get, like, if you were in 244 past 8 weeks, I would utilize your Revit model that you guys created for in-class assignment 5, those renders and floor plans or elevations or sections, and that's what I utilized to create a board. I'll show you in a second. But basically the instructions are to reassemble an old presentation or layout, include 3 vector graphics, including using one soft anchor point graphic, which is basically a curved vector line. And then utilize 3 images or drawings using the place tool, which is basically a way to link external files into your Illustrator file. And then use 2 different types of text boxes for titles, bullets, or body text. And then of course save it as a PDF and do not upload the Illustrator file. Upload a PDF of your board. So I will repeat that again. Do not upload your Illustrator file. Upload a PDF of your board. I had a couple of people for the PhotoShop upload the PhotoShop file instead of the images. So I just want to reiterate that. Do not upload your Illustrator file. It's too large, and it'll likely be that Blackboard will crash on you. There's some commands here that you might need, some notes, and you can Google Wikipedia raster versus vector. Raster are images, more or less. Vectors are straight lines that go forever. So those are like the main difference between vector and raster. But if you want to read more on what those two, the difference between those 2 graphics are, you can do that right here. So this is up on Blackboard. Hopefully everybody's compiled some images over the weekend so that you're not scrambling over the next 2 days to assemble something. The other thing that I posted, I found a tutorial on YouTube this morning that I thought was pretty good. I didn't watch all of it, but it's this link right here, Architectural Post-Processing in Photoshop, and it basically talks about post-process on this render, which is basically just the building. But he uses a lot of great techniques, so I'd recommend taking a look at that over break. He even shows a couple more tools that I have not shown. And then the last thing that I want to talk about before we jump into Illustrator is the bloom tool in Photoshop. And what that does is basically it brightens the image up. What am I got going on here? And so I'm just gonna delete these really quickly. And so this is the base image, and so if I go ahead and copy all this jazz, duplicate layers, and merge those layers together, under my filter tool I can utilize a Gaussian blur or Gunnison blur. I don't really know how to pronounce that, but Gaussian. You can bump this thing up, and you can see the more you bump it, the more out of focus the entire image gets. But if you just do a light bump and then utilize your over screen setting, it brightens the entire image up. And then you can go ahead and utilize other adjustments to kind of get it to where you want it. Or you could utilize a layer mask and do this. So if you just wanted the image, the base image, to pop out a little bit more with a little more vibrancy and color, it's a great tool to use. So that's kind of a very quick tutorial of the what's called a bloom adjustment. And then of course you can go, you can duplicate this again and utilize a high pass adjustment over it as well. And this may not work out, but you can see just adding that little bit of detail starts to pop out down in these areas. So that's another way to do an overall kind of adjustment to the entire image. So at any rate, just wanted to show you that. Go ahead and exit out of Photoshop. I don't think I'm going to save that. So Illustrator. I made this board last night. It took me about, 45 minutes to create. And I just utilized the images from the U of I Cultural Center that we created in 244 to make different types of text, some vector lines, which are these, also use some clipping masks. So if I double click in here, you can see that this image is actually all of this stuff, but I just utilized a clipping mask to crop that down, and you can start double clicking inside this thing. I don't always get it right the first time. And all of these lines are vector lines, which means you can select them and make changes to them. So this was basically a PDF that we printed, and then I just took a page of that PDF sheet set and placed it into here, and you're able to edit those PDFs, the line weights and things and such. And so I didn't actually delete any of that stuff. I just used a clipping mask. But this is basically an example of a 24 by 36 inch board. It's very basic, but it uses pretty much everything that we want you to utilize in the homework assignment. So this little arrow down here, if I select this guy and select this again, you'll see that I have these control points that allow me to make a curved line. And so that's basically what's called a I'm losing my grasp here, soft anchor points. And so we'll show you how to do those as well today. At any rate, this is an example of the type of board that we'd like to see out of you guys for the homework assignment. So basically the primary use of Illustrator is, some would argue about this, but create presentation layouts and boards, and then also creating vector graphics and diagrams. So this would be kind of considered a vector graphic diagram where I'm showing sun angles and how they enter the building, and how the heat flow works within the building. So stack ventilation, heat rises, and then you'd have some type of window up here that would allow the heat to escape, and a window down at the bottom to allow air in, and so you get a cross ventilation happening. And I'm sure you'll learn about that more in studios and ECS class, but that's a vector based graphic drawing or diagram. And so those are really kind of the two things that you'll utilize Illustrator for. Even if you don't do your presentation layouts in Illustrator, sometimes it's nice to make these vector graphics in Illustrator and then place that file into InDesign, which we'll talk about after the break. And so you have a toolbar system very similar to Photoshop in a lot of ways. It just looks a little bit different, and I'm going to guess that yours looks a little bit different than mine. I'm running CS 5.5, and I'm guessing that you guys are all in the cloud, which runs CS 6. And there's a couple of cool tools that I don't have that you guys have. For instance, with these vector lines in yours, you can actually utilize a gradient along the stroke path, which I can't do. So I'm very highly jealous of that tool, because you'll use it. You don't have to utilize this back screen that goes blue to red. You can do that in the actual vector line, which is this line here. You can in CS6. So, running through kind of menus and toolbars. File obviously allows you to create a new one, open an existing, save a copy, and print. And then document setup. So if after you've created your document and you want to change the way it looks, you can select document setup, and it brings you back to a screen that looks similar to, in some respects, a new document screen. So we'll talk about that in just a second. Edit, most copy, cut, paste. Interface tools. I don't use a lot of these tools here. Object transform, so that's similar to Photoshop, right, where you can rotate, scale, reflect, which is flip horizontally or vertically. I believe it gives you the choices. So arrange, this allows you to move objects forward and backwards in the screen instead of using layers to do that. So in Photoshop you have a series of layers that you can move up and down, and depending on their placement, the images are in front or in back of each other. So we had those three different background, foreground, and an image kind of layering system to keep that straight. And here you can utilize the arrange tool to move things back and forth without having to deal with layers. You can group objects together. So if you select multiple objects, and with the shift key we'll select multiple objects, you can either go up to object and say group, you can hit Control G, or you can also right click and join or group those together. Joining them makes them one object. Group just puts them, they just group them together so that you can still edit the individual pieces, but you can move them around at the same time. So if I group these together, they start to act, whoops. They should start to act as a group. It doesn't seem to be that way though. Why is that not working? Control G, right? Okay, I don't know why that's not working. At any rate, I'm sure you will figure that out at some point. I don't know why that didn't work. Do you know why, Clay? No? I don't know why. That's why I was...
So if you just select one, it doesn't drag you.
No, but they are grouped. So that's very strange. So at any rate, I don't want to waste...
That's an Illustrator file you placed in your Illustrator file.
What?
Didn't you know those two circles are grouped together, but they move separately?
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're not Illustrator files that I placed in an Illustrator. If that's what you were asking. Just made them in Illustrator. So at any rate, the object tool allows you to do a bunch of things similar to Photoshop. Oh boy. Got some hiccups today. The type tool starts to talk about changing different font types in the menu bar, but you have to have your text box selected, and while you're in it, you can do that in this options bar up here. So as you move from tool to tool, your option bars will change depending on what you use. So if we started writing text in here, we can start to change the type of text, and this text is all the different types of text that you have in Word or Photoshop, any of these softwares, Revit. So you can always add more if you want to. We talked about that in Revit a bit, but going online and downloading different texts, and we didn't actually do it, but when you open up and install a text, it comes into all these softwares, and it's in alphabetical order. Can change the type, whether it's regular or bold italic, the size of the text here, the type, the paragraph types, whether it's center justified, left or right justified, the opacity of it. Different colors and stuff you can do. I haven't played around with this recolor artwork yet, but I would encourage you to just get in the software and start playing around with stuff and seeing how it works. So another thing is that you can start to make it warp. So I have this text box selected, and you can make it do all sorts of crazy shapes. So you can have your text follow all sorts of different patterns. So that's how I got this University of Idaho to be arced, just using arc and then distorting this stuff. And so you'll see by moving this back and forth that it starts to change how that's looking on the board. It's a pretty small example, but any rate. So I guess before I get too far in, let's talk about creating a new file. So you go up to File, New. On the size, you should have some standard ones in here. Letter, tabloid, legal. Tabloid's 11 by 17. Letter's 8.5 by 11. You can also define a custom size here, width and height, and then you can change your units to being whatever you're comfortable with. I particularly like just using inches. And then you can set the bleed which is basically a margin, but it allows you to go full bleed. So like I believe this is a 1/2 inch larger than 36 by 24, and so the paper will print that margin out, and then you'd basically trim this down and you would have what's called a full bleed, which is where you don't have any margins. Or you could make this a negative number and you'd have a margin in here on your paper. So if you're making multiple art boards, you can increase the number of boards that you want here, and then you can define how you want them to lay out. So in a grid by row, grid by column, arrange by row, arrange by column. So if you have 2 boards and you want them to be laying out next to each other horizontally, you'd probably want to use the horizontal, and then at some point you could have images transfer from one board to the other, or you can do a lot of things. But and then spacing between the boards. So if you wanted to, like a 1/2 inch between this board and another board, it would space it a 1/2 inch over, and then you can define 1 column or 2 columns. I'm actually not entirely sure what that does. As it changes, as you change how you want these laid out, it gives you that option. So this is grid by row, and so it gives you an option to define 2 columns, or if it's by row, it gives you an option to do 2 rows. And you can see how these lines start to follow. It goes this way and then down to this one, and then over and then down, over and down. And then orientation, of course, you can change it from landscape to portrait, depending on, and it switches your numbers here. So if you already know or understand that, you can just make whichever one you want to be the larger number, and it'll make it landscape portrait on its own. And then you could create a template. So if we liked this layout, we could save this as a template file. And then the advanced settings, you can change your color mode from CMYK to RGB. And then you can also define kind of 3 different DPI settings. So 300, 150, 72. I probably wouldn't mess with the preview mode. So, excuse me. I'm just going to create one artboard. And I think I'm going to do similar size as what I have. Click OK. So it just gives me a blank artboard. Under View, you can turn on your rulers so that it gives you an idea of how big everything is here. And then also grids. So I believe also similar to Photoshop, you can start to drag off your ruler particular grid lines. And so if you wanted, something to be lined up really nicely, and with the snaps on, images will start to snap to those grid lines. Also, they'll snap to each other and they'll snap to the board edge as well. So if we wanted to make changes to this artboard after the fact, we go to our document setup, and we can start to define all sorts of crazy stuff. And we can edit the board itself. So if we want a smaller board, we can do that as well. And with the rulers on, it makes it fairly simple to do that, because as you can see, there's kind of a little dashed line on the ruler wherever my mouse is. And so you can define the size after the fact if you want to make a change to that. I believe I just press enter. So if you press enter as well while you're in here, it brings up artboard options where you can change the width and height this way as well. You can show center mark, crosshairs, all sorts of extra grid lines, more or less. Okay, so some of these toolbars that I have up here, pretty sure if you just hold on this thing and this arrow, so if you don't have any of these up, right, it's quick access. If you hold down with the left mouse button, you'll get kind of a couple options within each one of these tools, and if you want, you can select this little tear off arrow, and it basically creates a small window that allows you to use both of those tools. So some of these,
you can also just right click it.
yeah,
No.
not in mine.
Ours.
Any one of these that has a little down arrow, you can do that. And thank you for showing that shortcut. Because I don't have CS6, so not all of my stuff is going to look the same or do have the same function. But at any rate, yeah, right clicking doesn't work for me. So I like to have a few of these up.
If you hover over each one too, it'll show you the shortcut. Or it should. Right click.
Just tells you what the tool is. One of them,
I guess
T.
I just know the shortcuts.
Yeah, there's shortcuts for every software. I think, I don't know if we have a shortcut handout. I don't believe I do for this software, but again, as you hover over some stuff, you'll see that like T is shortcut for the type tool. Looks like what the hell is that symbol?
That's a //
Thank you. / for the line tool. At any rate, the pen tool, which is P, is a shortcut for that, is really useful in drawing vector lines. So when you start to click points, it connects it with a vector line. And if you click and hold, it creates a soft anchor point that curves, and it's a what are that French word? Belay. I can never pronounce that word. Something curve.
Bevel? No.
I'll forget it. Doesn't
Something
matter.
you guys learned in like 151 or something.
Stay away from French.
I know a little bit of French, not a lot.
There's no problems with English.
I do. So at any rate, you can make some really unique shapes, and then after the fact, you can utilize the black arrow allows you to select the entire object. This white arrow basically allows you to select individual points that you've created, and so you can manipulate this after the fact. And if you grab a soft anchor point, you have kind of handlebars that you can adjust or move in and out to soften the curve however you choose. And then, so when you have the whole object selected, right, up in your quick access bar here, you can change the stroke of it, which is basically how thick the line is. And so it could be really thick or really thin, depending on the line weight that you want to utilize. You can change the way that the line actually looks. So if I increase the size of this, you'll see that it goes from small to big, back to small again, and so that's that representation here. Or you have a couple other options as well. And then you can start to do brush effects with the actual line. So when we start to Control plus is the same as zooming in and out with Photoshop. It's the same tool. You can see that texture is starting to happen within that stroke. And I don't know, do you guys have these toolbars here up at all? So there's also one over here called stroke that if you select it, you can start to utilize more options. So again, we can change the weight here. We can create a dashed line. So that's a little funky, and so maybe we don't want, we just want a straight line. But you can define your dash, the gap, the dash, the gap, the dash. So you can create a custom grid dashed line if you want. And you can also add arrowheads to the front end and the back end of the actual stroke line, depending on what you want. And again, here's the profiles you can change as well. And then you can change the scale of the arrowheads here, I believe. And so maybe we want them giant. That looks terrible. But at any rate, you can manipulate the scale or the size of the arrowheads, which is kind of nice. And this little button links them together or not, depending on if it's on or off. And then this button here switches them back and forth between the two ends. I would recommend playing around with seeing what cap does and corner does. And it looks like you can change the limit size. And I'm going to guess that it defines what happens at corners. Thanks, Ryan. Appreciate that support. And then, so up here you have, there's a couple different places where you can access all these tools, right? So some of them are up here, some of them are over here, and they all kind of start to realize they're all kind of the same tools, just in different locations. And so we could add a color fill to this. So if you fully enclosed this thing, that fill color would fill in the inside enclosure. But since it's not enclosed, it's kind of just like closing the gap in some of these areas. It's not ideal to use, but it's good to know that you can do that.
Your gradient should follow that too.
Thanks, I was about to get to that.
I'll show that.
Yeah. So,
You said the gradient didn't work.
no, I didn't say that.
Then
I'm not going to argue with you. So now that we have a fill color in there, we can change it to a gradient. And so a gradient itself, you can start to play with that. And if you double click on one of those little dots, you can change the color of your gradient. And we can also up here start to create new color swatches. So this is a new gradient swatch, and I believe it was right here. So it's a little hard to read, but so now that we've created a new one, we don't have to utilize that black and white one. We can start to change the color and the opacity of our new color swatch, or gradient color swatch. And so you can basically transition from any color you want to any color you want. And so utilizing a closed loop pen, right, you come back and close it together, and now that fill looks a little better. And of course you can go back after the fact and manipulate your points of that object, and so you can really start to draw some interesting vector graphics. You don't have to always use the pen tool. You can utilize the line tool itself, and drag this out. You have some different options. So you can draw, cancel, click and drag to draw a single line. You can utilize the arc tool to draw an arc. Looks like a spiral tool here. And even a grid. So the pen tool, or a bullseye. I'm sorry, not the pen tool. The line tool itself gives you a lot of options in what you can draw. And then the rectangle tool allows you to draw multiple objects as well. So you have a rectangle, rectangle with rounded edges, circle, right, hexagon, stars, and some insane flare tool options where you can start to create splotches of color and ink in particular areas. To be honest, I've never used this tool, so I would suggest playing around with it if you like what it does. I'm assuming a halo starts to change these halo effects here. So, yeah. So I would imagine, like, if you wanted to, you know, look like you're looking into the sun, you kind of get that halo effect around an object. You could utilize this. It's kind of cool. but it's very dynamic, and you can make it bigger or smaller, change the opacity of it. So you guys can play around with that. And I would imagine you could change the colors of all this stuff as well, but it's basically like creating an artificial sun, right, somewhere on your image, so it looks like part of the render a little bit. Wow, I got the hiccups today. Okay, we talked about the line tool, the shape tool, the pen tool. We talked a little bit about selections. So there's two different types of selections, right? We select the entire object and allows you to transform it. And if you hold the shift key down, that kind of locks the angles on it. You can also go up to transform. You can move, scale, rotate. It gives you an angle. It's a little more awkward to use than the transform tool in Photoshop, because it kind of gives you can't just kind of play around with it. You have to kind of go, oh, I want that at a specific angle, and these toolbars. So you will get used to it though. You can also just kind of hover over this thing, and you'll see that two arrows with a kind of arc appear. You can also start to rotate it and scale it manually as well. And you basically want to utilize these control points. So when I hover over one of these control points, that's when I have the option, or they're anchor points, I have the option to utilize the transform tool. And so you kind of just have to play with it until you get whatever option you want, whether that's scaling or rotating. And again, if you use the shift key, it starts to lock to certain angles. And then also, when you're scaling, you can scale in both directions with the shift key. So if we right click, we can start to utilize these same tools with the object selected. And then we can say we want to move this object behind some of these other objects. We could do it basically in the order that we drew these objects, but that would take forever, because this send backwards just sends it backwards from the last object that you created. And so if you want to send it all the way to the back, you click send to the back. If you wanted to bring it all the way to the forward, you would say bring it all the way to the front. So that kind of talks about the arrange tool, and I'm just going to do it as an example, and you'll notice that it moved behind this object completely. And I can also create clipping masks. It didn't do exactly what I wanted it to do, but that's very useful. Let's talk about maybe placing a vector drawing and clipping it. So actually utilize it in a way that works well. I'm just going to delete all this stuff. So if we go up to File, we could we can place images and PDFs directly into this file, and it's not actually putting it in the file itself, it's linking it. So it's still somewhere off on our hard drive, and Illustrator is basically looking for that file in your system wherever you choose where that path goes. And so what that allows you to do is to reduce your file size. So if you imported that image in, right, to the actual file, your file would get really large eventually. And so this is a way to keep the file size fairly small, and fairly is it can be used respectively, but it's a way to keep the file relatively small, and so that in Illustrator is just going out and looking for these images, and they're not actually literally embedded into the file. Anyway, go to place. It takes me to a dialog box that allows me to search for an image, and I'm just going to go back to my 244 stuff. I feel like I need to go into my D drive though to get this stuff. University of Idaho, fall 24, 244. Assignments. It was assignment 3 originally, and so these are the images that I used basically. But let's take a look at just opening up this PDF. It has like 5 pages in it. I just want one of them, but if I open it and place it, it recognizes that there's 6 pages in this PDF, and so I can scroll through to a page that I want, say my elevations, right, and click OK, and that's already printed and scaled. This is giving a warning about fonts. I'm not really concerned about that, so I'm just going to click OK, and it places, Control minus to zoom out, it places that PDF that I created from Revit, right, directly into this folder or this file. And so it's not really arranged the way that I would want to arrange it on an artboard or a display board, but I can start to utilize, if I just draw a rectangle, say around this object, just this section, right? I can select that rectangle and my image and create a clipping mask. And what that does is it basically crops out or crops down just what I have selected. So it crops the rest of this image out. And I can go further into editing this by clicking into this and see up here at the top it says layer, and now I'm in a group, and you can start to open up group within group within group to get back down to selecting individual things, and I can start to delete certain things that I don't want. So that, now I'm just left kind of with the overall image. And then I can go back up here and run back through till I'm back to just my clipped object. Right? I don't really want that. This grid line. I can just turn them off.
You can also drag it.
Yeah, I wasn't able to select it because I think it was locked. So I just turned it off. But at any rate, that's how you can utilize clipping masks. So if you only want a piece of your vector drawing or a piece of your image, you can start to utilize the clipping mask to hide what you don't want to see. And that's similar to the Photoshop clipping mask, except you have a little more option with the Photoshop clipping mask. So we could start to, with the pen tool, start to define a base for this. So like maybe I don't really want to see this hatch pattern. And so I can start to create a border here. Whoops. And make that a closed loop. And I can fill it in if I had it selected with black or any other color that you choose you want to use. And so you don't have to be super careful about where you place this, because you just need to know how many points you want to be able to manipulate. And so once I do that, I can start to grab my anchor points and manipulate them to exactly where I want them. And so if I wanted this thing, to run across the entire board, you can start to do that. Or if I wanted to add, you can add, subtract, and change the actual anchor points. So if I wanted to add a few more anchor points to this path, I could do that. Or I could subtract them, take them away. I could also make them soft anchor points. And then I can start to, sometimes it just doesn't want to cooperate, but if you click on the anchor point itself a couple times, you can usually get it selected. And you can do all sorts of crazy things. If I wanted to add some text, right, I could use the text toolbar here and drag out some text. And right now the characters are black, but I could change them to another color, like white, and we could change the size of our the text itself. I don't know, I'm just randomly picking a text. Maybe make it really large and start to create headings for your different drawings. Talking about text a little bit further, we have a lot of different options up here. We talked about the flash text, I believe. No, we didn't talk about flash text, but we did talk about I'm actually curious to see what this stuff does. Ooh. Could make it I don't know. I'm not really familiar with this tool, and I don't think I should be playing with it right now. But we can start to warp this text. Let's see what this does. Shell upper.
Syntax.
You have to bend it. You can bend it
You might have like highlight the text.
No, it shouldn't have to.
Oh,
My preview's not on. Duh. Okay. Yeah. So you can start to do some crazy things with text here. And make it look like it's, I don't know, coming at you. Weird angle. I think I remember when I was, and you can change kind of the way that it's shaped here as well. You can do this vertically or horizontally. But if you look at like Einstein's logo and things like that, that was like certainly made in a software like Illustrator, just using vector lines and soft anchor points and clipping masks and things like that. So it's really one of those softwares that I like to think is like you're creating an artboard or like a logo or a vector drawing where you're adding some creating diagrams to put on your board, more than actually creating boards, but they like to tell you here that you can utilize it to create your actual boards. And you can, but I find that mine crashes all the time because apparently it only uses one processor, because it's a 32-bit software, and yours V6 actually uses more as a 64-bit, so it can use multiple processors, which means yours probably won't crash as frequently as mine, which is why I do everything in InDesign and not Illustrator. But let's see here. That runs through a lot of the tools. We can also, what?
You're gonna show them how to write text on a pen light?
Oh, yeah.
You showed them that.
You can do that. Okay, I can do that.
It's useful.
So, kind of forget the steps, but I'll bullhead my way through it because I'm good at doing that. So we can create a line, and then you can pick a path for text and start to type along that path. Or you can start to, ooh, that's really tiny. Where'd it go? Oh, I don't know what button I just pressed. I went full screen.
Did you hit escape?
So you can start to type vertically. You can also rotate text as well, I believe, fairly easily to whatever direction that you want as well.
No, that one's if you, so click that tool and then click on your pen line on the bottom where your black is.
What? Wait, what?
The equivalent of your ground.
What, this black?
Yeah, if you click on that. Oh, it's not enclosed, is it? Okay. You can, with that tool, you can choose to type within a figure that you created and enclosed in a pen.
Ah,
It's just giving you a problem at the moment.
yeah.
But anyway, the point of the follow the line with the pen tool is go back and click on the text. I think you can grab the A, or the white arrow.
Yeah, you can start
grab
to,
those lines and start to change it.
yeah, you can move it around.
And so you can also arc it and curve it.
Looks like I added, yeah. Accidentally, my first control point was a soft curve. So, yeah, so you can curve around that line as well with the text. And I'm sure if I had added more text in there that it would look, or not.
It starts from the point where you start the text line, or the text again.
Ah,
So if you grab that little white, click on just the text. It's more difficult now, but yeah, you can move it around.
yeah, let's not get into all that jazz. But just know that you can start to do some crazy stuff with text. So I'd suggest experimenting with that when you create your board, and maybe utilize some of these different configurations of text to make your board unique. Jeez. Blob brush tool. Looks like it works similar to, it's basically creating a vector line with the brush tool. So it gives you a bunch of anchor points that you then can manipulate even further, which is kind of cool. And it looks like it's a fill, but it's actually a stroke line. Oh no, when you start to expand that, it becomes a fill. Okay. Pencil tool allows you to write things. Maybe if you're good with your mouse, you can, do your signature or something like that. The erase tool starts to erase this stuff. It kind of erases everything. So be careful with the erase tool. I'm hitting Control Z to undo that. Rotate tool. Similar to a rotate, but it's just an individual tool that allows you to rotate around a specific point. This is a quick access to your scale tool. I'm not sure what this does. This warp tool, width tool, warp tool, twirl tool. Kind of cool. I don't know how useful that is for architectural boards, but I'm sure one of you could find a way to use that very uniquely and make your board look cool.
Looking like a pretty cool board already.
Yeah. These are a lot of art tools, which you probably won't utilize, but play around with them. I encourage you to play around. Free transform. So these are kind of quick access to doing the same things as we've already talked about. Paint bucket tool. It's kind of cool. So I've got these different filled objects here. And with this select shape builder tool, what I have selected here, live paint bucket, allows you to select individual parts of it to fill with the paint bucket.
I think Shape Builder actually cuts them into different shapes, so you can move them.
Check out this perspective thing. Perspective grid toolbar. This kind of seems like a fairly cool tool. If you really want to get into drawing a lot of stuff in Illustrator. not quite sure how to select it and make changes to
I don't
it.
think you can.
Yeah. No, it doesn't seem like it
Oh,
wants
it's
to.
right there at the bottom, the little 3 white arrows, so you can change the perspective.
Oh, cool. Very
But I think
interesting.
it's just a tool for you to reference for drawing.
Yeah.
It's pretty cool.
Which you probably won't ever use, but it's still pretty cool. Oh, and there goes my something there. Eyedropper tool allows you to select a particular color, and then also place it. So, no, okay, it's not working exactly the way that I want it to.
Use the one above the gradient. That's the one you're looking for.
This?
Yeah, I think if you add the mesh, you can then change it. Well, you have to have something selected.
At any rate, these are all tools that you probably won't utilize that we're playing with right now, except maybe the change color tool. And then obviously there's a spray paint tool here that allows you to not do anything, because for some reason, please select a symbol from the symbol panel first. Symbol panel, huh? Okay, I obviously don't know what I'm doing with that tool. Ooh, what's that? I don't have any 3D objects to rotate. I'm going through these tools kind of crazy, but down here is similar to Photoshop, right? In the sense that you've got your black and your white, and I bet if I press X it flips back and forth between those two. And this is actually the stroke fill and then the fill itself. And with 5 minutes left, let's place like an image. Just gonna click and place an image in here. And you can see it starts to align to certain things, and we can scale this up or down. And so you can place images anywhere. You could also maybe, what the heck's going on with my circle tool? There it is. Hold the shift key down. And now I can select both of these and create a clipping mask so that I'm only looking at a certain part of this image. So you can do that with any image, basically.
And if you do it the other direction, the square, the circle, it should clip just the circle, right?
If you select it in the opposite order.
Yes.
Yeah. So if I select my image first and then the path tool.
No.
Yeah, I didn't think it would, but I'd give it a shot. I think it's whatever's in front of the other. So if I could be talking out of my wazoo here, but you'd send that to the back and then also select and create a clipping mask. Oh, I was sure that was going to work, but it didn't. I don't know why you'd want to cut a hole out of your image anyways. But so all that stuff that we kind of running through here is also available in these toolbars as well. So when you're talking about text, paragraphs, hyphenate, so you can, if you have a large body of text and you don't want hyphenation to happen, you can uncheck that button so that it'll end up correcting, so you won't have hyphenations going from one line to another. And it's similar to kind of any other text operations here as far as the points in between, the spacing between the lines, your justifications, and characters, all sorts of fun stuff. Okay, so you can also place PhotoShop files as well. So if we go to like this Photoshopped image, so that's the original Photoshopped image, and in InDesign, you can right-click and say Edit the Original, and it would open up Photoshop. It'd allow you to make changes to that image, and then you could load it back in. But we're not in InDesign. I was hoping that this function was there for Illustrator as well. So that's a pretty quick laydown for Illustrator. From this, you should be able to create a board utilizing images that you already have. I would suggest utilizing some stuff you've done in second year studio, maybe a board layout, or if you haven't done one yet and you were in 244, utilize your Revit file that you created for in-class assignment 5, and just print PDFs off of the different stuff that you want to put on your board. And that's about it. If you don't have any of that stuff, maybe go online and grab a couple images and utilize images from an online source. But I'm sure everybody has photographs that they've taken and have saved on their computer somewhere, so you could utilize personal photographs. Maybe you want to make an artboard that has your family portrait on it or something. I don't know. So be creative with it, but definitely follow the guidelines as the amount of images and vector graphics that we want on the board, and utilize I guess we can talk about this next class, but you can save a copy as a PDF, an Adobe PDF, and you can also print to a PDF as well, right? Utilizing the Adobe PDF or CUDA PDF, and we'll talk about this, I guess, next class. Everyone sign in.
Yeah, once you know.
You should save that board that I came up with.